Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, good afternoon everyone. Welcome back to the International Conference on Assessment and Learning. This is the second keynote speaker. Let me introduce, and actually we are honored to have this prominent figure in psychometric to be our second keynote speakers. Dr. Hattie, I'm sorry, I always goes with just John. John Hattie. John Hattie is an emeritus laureate professor of education at the University of Melbourne. He is also the chair of the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, through which he provides national leaderships in promoting excellence so that teachers and school leaders have maximum impact on learning. Professor Hattie designed the assessment tool for teaching and learning that allow teachers to design assessment, analyze report, and obtain resources to improve the quality of their teaching and their students' learning. His influential work, Feasible Learning, is believed to be the world's largest evidence-based study into the factors that improve student learning. The groundbreaking study involved more than 80 million students from around the world and brought together 50,000 smaller studies. Feasible Learning found that positive teacher-student interaction is the most important factor in effective learning. I actually know personally John in a strange way. He's graduated from University of Toronto. My two advisors at the University of Massachusetts, Ron Hamilton, the late Red N. Swaminathan, also graduated from the University of Toronto, and John spent, I think, about one year sabbaticals at the University of Massachusetts, where we met. Okay, the title of John's presentation today is The Status of Classroom Assessment to Support Learning. John, we are looking forward for your presentation.
Thank you, Europe, and it's good to see you again after many occasions that we've met over the years, and thank you for inviting me here today. The title of the conference, Assessment and Learning, and that's going to be really critical to where I go. Unfortunately, I had an hour's presentation, but we're down to 30 minutes before I have to finish, so I'm going to hit the highlights here about where I want to go. And Jeff, I don't have a clicker, I'm doing this. My message today is that we need to reclaim assessment back for our classrooms. For many teachers, assessment is a dirty word. It's something that's been done unto them. It's something that's been used for accountability in ways that sometimes they don't like. And whilst I have no troubles with many of those systems, I do think it is time that we do reclaim back to our classrooms. Yes, Europe, 2008, I did publish this book, and it kind of changed my life. Before then, I had a very happy life being a psychometrician, working in measurement, and enjoyed working with the International Test Commission, with my colleague like Europe, with Swami and Jane Rogers, Ron Hamilton, etc., etc. But this thing came along. Now, here's the good news. The world didn't change. And next March, I'm releasing a sequel. It's not an update in the sense that it's just going to be the same book over again, because I've done that, been there. I'm trying to put the story more up front this time. It's also based on other people who have looked at doing what I have done, which is synthesizing many studies. We did a synthesis a few years ago on learning strategies. I was involved in one on motivation. We're about to release one on synthesizing all the work on self-concept. And others are looking at emotional and social learning. And part of the message you heard from Jeff this morning is how powerful they are as part of this equation called learning and achievement. The other thing that's happened is the meta-analyses haven't stopped. I had 800 in 2008. I now have 2,100. I now have gone from 80 million students to 400 million students. Not a bad sample size. But the distribution hasn't changed. Who's surprised? When you have distributions of that sample size, you don't expect much difference over the last 12 years. The average effect of all influences is still about 0.4. And my fascination is, what's the story between those influences greater than 0.4 and those less than 0.4? And as you can see in the blue zone then, there's not many things we do that to kids that harm them. There are some. I should point out the largest negative effect at education at minus 0.6 is when we label students. Because sadly, labelling often leads to low expectations. And I welcome countries like Italy who have banned within and across class and school grouping. And New Zealand's just come out with their 2 unions, teachers' unions, opposing it. But that's a detail. I want to come back to the big story. But I'm not going to go into the detail of visible learning today. That's another story. I have released a couple of years ago a free website if you want all the data, which I try and keep up to date. MetaX, it's got all the data, what all the influences are. So if you want to know an influence, that's where you go. Today I want to come back to the big story. And these are the big 7 messages. And as you read through these, I want you to have that word assessment in mind and how critical it is for teachers in evaluating their impact to use evidence. Evidence from the test scores, evidence from their noticing, evidence from the artifacts of kids' work, and evidence from the students' understanding and perception of their progress. And it's the triangulation of that evidence that informs the next best learning steps, that informs the best diagnosis of where the student is, and informs the teachers about their impact. I don't care how teachers teach. I care about the impact of their teaching. And I deliberately use that word evaluator to emphasize the value word of it, about how we have to evaluate the evidence. I didn't use assessment, because that's part of the evaluation, but it absolutely is in there. And that whole list, which I think always stuns me, that there's virtually not a student. It kind of doesn't matter who the student is in terms of the impact we have on them. I know that upsets a lot of people. But what works best tends to work with all students. And it's that focus on learning. It's that focus on challenge. It's that focus on expectations, errors, and feedback. And that relentless getting proportion of surface and deep, the content and the deep learning. We love to come up with dilemmas on education, such as whether we do lots of content or whether we do deep learning. I'm greedy. I want both at the right time. So what are the effects, if I look at the visible learning work, on assessment? Well, there they are. Still doesn't work there. Very simplistic, very straightforward, but they're all pretty healthy. And anyone who says that assessment doesn't help teaching and learning misunderstands the evidence. But I want to go deeper. I think we spend far too much time talking about tests, our whole history. We've talked too much about tests. If way back at the beginning someone talked about test reporting and interpreting tests, I think our manual of test standards would be dramatically different and better. And I think we need to spend a lot more time on the psychology and the understanding of interpreting test scores. Very soon, the next edition of our Educational Measurement Handbook will come out, and for the first time, there will be a chapter in that written by Ron and others on interpreting test scores and the psychology of doing it. And I take the very strong line that we should start there, backward design. Come up with our test scores, and from that, many of you in the room in psychometrics, it is not difficult to create a good test. But getting that test scores correct. And I put 2 questions up. And we've spent a lot of time in our work answering these questions. And I remember when I first started this in 2000, we had a report. It took us 80 focus groups to even get close to asking what are the teachers, what are the students, what are the parents, what do the leaders see, what do they interpret, and what would they do next? Too many of our test reports are created by lovely design people who sit down and come up with pretty pictures and lovely, beautiful diagrams. And then we blame you for misinterpreting them. But if you believe in Messick's notion of consequential validity, we should be starting backwards with those test reports and then moving forward. And this is where I want to come to my major message today. Surely, if we're administering any kind of assessment to a student, it's incumbent upon us to teach the student how to interpret the results of their tests. What happens in your class when you give a test back? The kids look at the grade, they look at the number, they might look at your comments. But do they know, as a consequence of that test, what the next best learning should be? If they don't, I think we've failed them. And my argument is, if we want to give assessment back to the classrooms, we start here, developing assessment-capable students. And when we first started doing this in our work, one of our unions got very upset with us and said, "But you're taking the teacher out." And we said, no, the opposite. If you want all that formative and summative and all that lovely stuff, you teach it to the students. And of course, the teachers then have to know it too, don't they? Assessment should not stop with the teachers. So what is an assessment-capable student? I'm going to introduce you 6 notions. Firstly, they know where they are. And Jeff talked about the continuum, the growth, the progressions. They know where they are. And sometimes I don't think we're as good at diagnosis as we think we are. What we do instead is we say, oh, the curriculum says this is where we should go next. But where is the student and each student on that curriculum progression? Can students talk about what they don't know? And here's the dilemma. Often novices don't know what they don't know. And sometimes exposing the students early on about what they don't know and listening to them. And it certainly happened a lot during COVID, where the students were much more prepared to talk using their social media about what they didn't know. And many of the parents, some of them got quite upset. Oh, my child doesn't know, it's too confusing, it's too hard. And you say, yes, that's the essence of learning. And it's merging all those different parts. And Jeff had a much nicer picture than I did from Datno's work, except I did notice in that work that learning was missing from that picture. You could probably argue it's an intellectual competence, but I want to put it right out there up front of how we can teach the students the strategies of learning. And don't anyone tell me that a student is not motivated. Oh my goodness, every student who walks into your class walks in with an incredible amount of motivational resources that they may not want to spend it on the stuff you do. So our job is to convince them and invite them back to learn the stuff that we value. I also I want to follow up what Jeff was talking about achievement. And I would argue in Australia at the moment, we're obsessed with achievement. We have high standards. We love schools that have high achieving kids. And quite frankly, it's killing us. And when I speak to ministers, I say, well, Minister, it's also about progress. And they get very excited. Oh yeah, we've got to have lots of progress. But wait a moment, Minister. It's both. Remember, I'm greedy. It's through progress to achievement. And I can take the average you can see down there on growth, and no surprise I measure that in effect sizes. I can look at, on this continuum, achievement. We've got 1,000 measures of achievement. And my argument is that those are not our best schools necessarily. High achieving schools, go back one, thank you. High achieving schools are not necessarily our best schools. We have an incredible number of cruising schools. Kids who start above average, who don't make a year's growth. Our best schools are our growth schools. Why is it a teacher or a student who is down here, who started low but added more than a year's growth, why aren't they seen as esteemed? Much more so than a teacher who starts with kids above average and doesn't make a year's growth. And I can translate that into students as well. Like take Tane and Daniel up there. On achievement, that was a mistake, thank you. On the achievement continuum, Tanya and Daniel are the brightest kids in the class. Top scores. But in terms of what's happening, they are dramatically different. I want to know, teacher, what you did to Danielle that you didn't do to Tane. Tane is not a success. Tane is unfortunately having quite poor teaching steps. But I bet Tane is happy to get the highest score. His parents are happy. The teacher is happy, but they shouldn't be. In the same way, if you look at Ella and Chris, I want to go up to Ella and say to Ella, Ella, you're one of the best learners in this classroom. Yeah, she's got a low score. But the whole notion is that it's through progress to achievement. And we've got to get a lot smarter at changing the debates in our classroom that rewards high scores, high achievement. Sometimes high scores mean the work was too easy. We can also look, and I'm doing a feed here for Andreas tomorrow, and his talk tomorrow. We can look at PISA results, and we can look at who improved, and we can look who didn't improve. It's a good one not to put up because Australia's in that bottom list. But the point here is that it's based on achievement. If we actually took, as I would argue in every school, and I hope it's what you're doing in your Indonesian database, that we looked across the many dimensions, we get a totally different picture. For example, I took, and yeah, they're crude indicators of countries. It was the best I could find. It was to make the point. I took measures besides achievement. Absolutely, it's included in my equations at all times. And when I rank those same countries, I get an incredibly different ranking system. Suddenly Australia doesn't look as disastrous as it does if you just take achievement and you just overemphasise high achievement, which leads you to skewing what you do at a nation level, let alone what you do in a classroom. The second part of an assessment-capable student is they understand where they're going, and critically they have the confidence to take on challenges. I always think it's fascinating when you look at the research on gifted students. It's why is it that nearly all gifted students don't become gifted adults? Less than 2% of child prodigies go on to be gifted adults. And many of the argument is because they have no confidence to take on challenges when they don't know. When they get out of their comfort zone, they don't have that ability to take on challenges. And the most successful learner is those that are prepared to take on that challenge, making sure the challenge is not too hard, not too easy, or not too boring. Making sure that we help the students understand not only where they are, in terms of diagnosis right now, but also where they need to be in terms of their success criteria. And you can see some of the success criteria I used in a recent course. And the object of teaching is to close that gap. Now, the more the students are aware of what success looks like as they start, the more they're likely to get there. It's exactly how their video games work, how their sport and their social life works. They know what the goal is. And so that notion of making it more clear to them. Now, as Graham Nuttall pointed out, close to 40 to 50% of everything taught in every class the students know already. The problem in many classrooms is the work's too easy. It's just doing. And when we analyse our 200,000 students on an app we have, asking them about their emotion at the end of every lesson, the dominant emotion, by a long way, dominates the page, is boredom. So sometimes the work isn't related to that progression that Jeff talked about. So these are the three questions that are core to this part of the assessment stable student. They can answer these three questions. Obviously, I want the teacher to answer them too. And so when I go into schools and we ask them, where are you going? Too often they say, oh, I'm going to complete this piece of work. Yeah, but complete it, do it, or to what standard? And when you've finished it, where do you go next? Oh, I hand it in. No, that is not an assessment-capable learner. That is not someone who is learning the skills of becoming their own teacher. Let me go through those three notions, because they're going to come back a couple of times. Being clear about success criteria, being clear about goals. And I know this sometimes upsets teachers, because when they're clear to the students say, correctly, in some cases, I already know how to do that. That upsets some teachers. And in our assessment system where we've been building, where students do get information about where they're going, that is the case. So how am I going? Now, teachers are brilliant at this, telling students how they're going. But the argument I'm putting to you is we need to teach the students how they're going. Okay, you're doing this work now. How are you going relative to where you started and what the goal is? And this is where peer assessment, self-assessment, self-evaluation. 5-year-olds are brilliant at it. By the time they get to 8, they're told it's the teacher's job. And I think that's a sad case. And the where I'm going. Helping students understand what the next learning step is, what the next goal is, how they move forward. The third part is we teach students to select the tools so that they can guide their own learning. And this is where the learning strategies and learning how to learn becomes really critical. We've been developing a model of learning that goes from what skill, what will, the dispositions and what motivations, the thrill the student brings into the class. We're looking at when they're first exposed to content, the surface level knowledge, how they then consolidate it to move on to deeper knowledge and then to transfer. And when we did our synthesis of learning strategies, you can see there's a kind of top 12 there. But here's the problem. It depends when you use them. And there's a skill at choosing when to learn them. If you do outlining and summarising when you're in deep learning, the effect size goes close to 0. If you have too much student talk when it's at the content level, the effect size goes close to 0. But look at student talk at the deep level. And one of the fascinations for me is, and I ask you this, how many tests of achievement do you have at your fingertips? And every teacher in the room has thousands. You can create one overnight in 5 minutes if you have to. Let me ask you this then. How many tests of learning do you have? If learning is so critical, it's in the name of this conference, how come in our assessment community we haven't been very good at developing assessments of learning strategies? When we were writing our work up, I happened to have access to 20,000 hours of teacher transcripts of classes. And I thought, I'm going to go through and see how many times a teacher either thought aloud as they were solving a problem, they asked the student to think aloud as they were solving a problem, or they gave the student an alternative learning strategy when their first one didn't work. And after 20,000 hours, I found exactly, I found exactly 0. What would happen in your class? It's such a mystery to some of our students as to how I go about the learning strategies. They want to hear aloud from you how you go about solving problems. This big secret to getting the answers, it's in here. And I know I get criticised for the term visible learning because it's not visible. And my point is that's the whole reason for the name of it. How do we make that learning more visible? How do we teach students to have a second strategy when the first doesn't work? In a month or so, I'm about to release a free website where we've developed assessments for those 12 and resources for teachers and students, and trying to get that into the name of the game. And in our visible learning work, it's a very hard one. And you said it before, Jeff. I haven't got time to do that. I have to get through the curriculum. I don't think we're doing our students any favours if we're not also understanding and teaching them the strategies of learning. And we teach the student to seek feedback. Now, I'm pausing there because a lot of my research was about how we help teachers give feedback. A third of feedback has a negative effect. And trying to understand the variability of feedback is the absolute key here. And we spent a lot of time before we wrote our book on that question. Why is I give feedback to you today and it works? I give you the same feedback tomorrow and it doesn't. That variability is key. And so the way we resolve that, I want you to help me here. Take a moment. Someone walks up to you, you're in an elevator, going down 4 levels of the elevator, and someone says to you, "What do you mean by feedback?" What's your answer? Now, I need you to do this because of where I'm going. What does feedback mean to you? All right, put it aside for a second. I do want to come back to that, your concept of feedback. Very effective, very variable. Imagine if we got rid of that third that was negative. The power of feedback would be even more. The way we resolve it is this, the variability issue. It's answering these 3 questions. Feedback is the answer to these 3 questions. So we've seen them before. That one, where am I going? Being clear to the students about what success looks like. Working on personal bests, helping them see progress through to achievement. It's about how am I going? And as I said, teachers are brilliant at that. That's where the dominant amount of feedback happens, helping students understand where they're going. And the third one, where to next? How we help them go into enhanced challenges, deeper understanding. And when we ask thousands now, literally thousands of teachers about what they understand by feedback, they say it's one of these 10. And I ask you, did you come up with one of these? Now, if you didn't, I'd love to hear about it, and it doesn't have to start with C. We're very proud of this list. Pretty encompassing. When we asked thousands and thousands of students, however, they don't say any of these. To them, feedback is one thing: where I go next. So much of our feedback, so much of our test analysis has been about where you've been. And on the one hand, that's desirable because it sets up the diagnosis of where you're going. But from the student's point of view, if it doesn't help them move forward, they can stand there. And I've seen this happen with 2 pages of teachers' written commentary saying, "But I got no feedback." Because for them it is, how do I help where I go next? And this is why I've switched my focus on feedback from teachers to students. Was the feedback that you give the students understood, heard, and actionable? What is effective feedback? It was heard, understood, and actionable. And on our diary analysis, students on average receive about 3 seconds of feedback a day. And you know those students, particularly those of you who have teenage kids, they are very good at selective listening. They also know that sometimes feedback costs. I'm going to have to do it again. Wasn't good enough. So they don't hear it. And this is why we put this emphasis on student assessment capabilities, helping the students hear it, understand it. So the next time you give an assessment, you give all those comments. Wait a day, so it's not just short-term memory, and then ask the students to jot down, what did they understand by that assessment you gave them a couple of days ago? It can be pretty sobering. And my point is, that's what we should spend our time on, helping our students interpret that information. And feedback thrives on errors. I'm now at the stage of life where I'm a granddad. I had my 6th grandchild 2 days ago, very proud of it. My oldest granddaughter is 6. And up until the age of 5 and 6, they thrived on error, making mistakes. And Emma is already learning, as she's starting school, that mistakes are embarrassing. If you don't know the answer and can't put your hand up, look like you do. Dare not to be wrong, dare not to be challenged, and dare not to fail. And I want the opposite. Because that's when feedback's powerful. That's when learning happens. That's challenging. And when we come into schools and we ask students, what do they mean? Who's the best learner in this classroom? Sadly, it's often the kid that knows lots, sits up straight, is well prepared, and watches the teacher work. The opposite of a good learner. So how do we make errors welcoming? I had 4 boys, teenage boys in my life, and they were brought up in North Carolina, so no surprising, that's the poster of Michael Jordan I put on their wall. Now that I have 5 granddaughters, I'm looking for a female model, and Ash Barty, our tennis player, is the best I can come up with at the moment. But that's the message that we need to teach students, that errors, mistakes, not knowing, that's the reason you're at school. I mentioned social media earlier, and I want to come back to that. Technology has not had a great run in terms of the effect sizes over the last 50 years. 0.3, they're there. We discovered a few years ago that students are willing, using social media apps, to talk about what they don't know, but they won't talk to the teacher, even if the teacher's standing beside them. And again, we saw that during COVID teaching. They'll use those chat rooms, etc., to talk to each other. But their classrooms are so socialised that errors are embarrassments. I think the biggest revolution facing us is social media. Once we get over our problem that it's got all kinds of negative effects, which it can do, but it's got absolutely marvellous positive effects if we know how to use it well. And the 5th is this notion of helping students self-question, to plan and organise, to monitor and adjust their learning, to be active participants in their learning. And when Amy Berry did the work with me before she was stolen by ICAL, when Amy Berry was doing her work on engagement, what she found is when she asked teachers what do they mean by engagement, they said engagement is when the kids are doing the work. And in a lot of doing, there is no learning. So she conceived of engagement as moving on a continuum from disrupting through avoiding and withdrawing. And we all know those disruptive kids in our class. But sadly, those who also avoid and withdraw often have the same learning profile as those who disrupt. And then moving them from that participating to asking them to invest and drive and use those motivational resources to go deep and enjoy the passion of learning. And how they then, the aim is for students to use that assessment information so that they can review, they can plan their next steps. Obviously with your help. You're still there as the expert, but we teach them how to do this, and they see assessment. And the last one is learning from others. Probably the biggest change from when I was a student in schools many eons ago is employers are asking now, not in the future, they're asking now for your graduates to be team players, to be translators, to be communicators. And given the status of knowledge now, where it's becoming so specific, the employers are saying, if you don't have sufficient knowledge, I can teach you that. But if you can't work in teams, if you can't communicate, if you actually look at the employment statistics, those students who have higher social skills and team playing skills are employable compared to those who have high knowledge and low team playing skills. If I walked into your classrooms, would I see kids sitting together, working alone? Would I see occasions of high stakes testing where they're working together? And we get assessments about the teamwork and the individual's contribution to the team. Because if you're not making your employers, your graduates employable. And so it comes back to this as the major notion of an assessment-capable learner. It comes back that my argument to you today, if we want to reclaim assessment for our classrooms, we've got to do it through the eyes of the students and stop seeing assessment as stopping at the teachers or at the school leaders. But we therefore have to deliberately not only teach our students how to interpret the assessments, we have to teach our teachers how to teach the students to interpret the assessments. So they become the friends of learning. They're not the endpoints. And in many ways we've got fancy words for this. And even if you don't like assessment-capable learners, surely those skills are the essence of self-regulation. And so that's why, in being invited to this conference, probably 2-3 years ago now, given what's happened so we can get here, when I saw the title of Assessment and Learning, I said, yes, those are the two things we should be highlighting. We've left learning behind. We've left assessment in the hands of the teachers and the school leaders, whereas what we need to do is have this major focus on assessment-capable learners. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay. Now we have about 10 to 15 minutes for question and answer. I try to take note of the keynote speakers, and not too long that I know my full page, a lot of words, so instead of reading it back to you, let's use the time for question and answer. Any questions? Please raise your hand if you have any question. I see one on the left. Okay, two. So 1, 2, and 3 in the back. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. Please state your name, your affiliation, and then you can directly ask your question.
Good morning. My name is Hattie from National Center of Assessment. It's very interesting to hear your presentation. Obviously, especially for me, it's about often focus on testing and scoring, but not much attention on interpreting the meaning of the scores. For your information, as what being presented today from Pak Nino, in 2021, we have a huge transformation on assessment, especially for national assessment. Usually, we only provide information to school about the student achievement, but since 2021, we not only provide about the student achievement, but also about their school climate with all the indicators. So actually we have problem about how to make sure that the school principal and teachers understand what the scores are about and how to interpret and make a follow-up action to those reports. We have so many indicators, and we know exactly that our school principal from west to the east have a very diverse ability to digest all the information. So what do you think? How we do the strategy on communication, all the scores and the indicators to different school principal? Do we need to have like several reports that the school with higher ability to digest the information get all the indicators, while other school maybe only subsets of indicators? And how we really give facilitation to all the school principals to understand where they are and what they should do with all the data that very, very rich, but on the other hand means very, very big data and too many information maybe for some of them. Thank you.
So basically, strategy of communication. How we communicate to school master about the results of assessment and the very rich data. How we go about doing the communication so they can make use of them.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm deaf as a doorpost, and the trouble with masks is I can't lip read. So excuse me if I get the question wrong there. I'll answer your question in terms of my experience. When I was living in New Zealand, we had this issue. We took the argument that the whole point of a national assessment scheme is to help students interpret. And so our inspectorate system, which they have there, they judged the answer to your question by whether the students could interpret the results from the national assessments. And that was their major focus. It wasn't on whether the students all did well, because you saw the problem with that. They all can do extremely well but not grow. And if we believe, as certainly I do, that our job is to impact students, not to stop at the teachers, then if the students can't interpret the assessments, I'm not sure the assessments are that valuable. That's probably too strong, but I've seen so many cases, particularly our time living in America, where tests are everywhere, they dominate everywhere, but they stop at the principal's desk, they stop at the teacher's desk. So I put the primary questions about, are the students aware of where they are, how they're going and where they're going, and use that to a judge. Suddenly you'll find, as we did, schools collected an incredible amount of data that had no effect on anything. Getting them to stop that was hard, because they said we've always been doing it. In fact, my current work is on this notion of de-implementation. How do you stop schools doing things that are not helpful to students? Because they do a tremendous amount of non-helpful things. So if I'm hearing your question correctly, my answer to your question is you start with the students and you use that. And if they don't understand it, it doesn't matter that the principal's got it right. If there's no trickle effect through onto the students, I'm not sure it does.
Oke, mudah-mudahan menjawab pertanyaannya, Bu.
I'll follow up with you afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, second.
Terima kasih, Pak Urip. My name is Apri Agung. I'm working in the ministry. How you actually contextualize what you come with the solution already in Australia with the context in Indonesia? But the thing with that is actually, if we could not compare apple to apple, of course. So my question is to you is actually related how you contextualize the thing that we have in Indonesia so far. I mean, when you're talking about this learning at the micro level, at the school level, you have to consider the teacher have also some challenges related with the policy and everything. So how you come to a suggestion how to improve this, so we could focus on what Jeff said related with growth mindset,
okay,
and what you said we focus on the feedback for student at the meso and macro level, so to support teachers' performance. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you for that. And two parts of your question. The first part, if you didn't write everything down, I will find a way through the organisers to get the PowerPoints to you. And given I had to cut short my time, the last 15 minutes I was going to answer your question by showing you what we built that was based on helping the students understand, looking at the score reports to make the students understood, and then feeding that back up. And we did it in a voluntary system. Schools can volunteer to use it, and what we're very proud of is 80% of schools are still using it in that country 21 years later, because it's helping them answer the questions about how you make students assessment capable. But they're on the end of the slide, so that's just an extra. But we ran out of time here today.
Okay, thank you for your question. I see from the corner. Yang tadi mengacung tangan di sudut. Oh, nggak jadi. Yang tengah silakan. Terakhir ya. Biar panggungnya ikut rame, dua-duanya berdiri aja udah.
Thank you.
Sudah terdengar. Ya.
Thank you. I do really interested in what you have presented. How teacher teach the students to learn. That's my favorite tagline when I was still a teacher. Right now I'm not a teacher anymore. I'm Evi Andriani. Ministry. I just want to say something about how the teacher can develop various assessment. Long time ago, when most of teachers still do not really have high competences on developing an assessment instrument and something like that. But 5 years ago, when we got a kind of short courses in Australia, we learned with Mr. I forgot the name. And then at the time, the solution for Indonesian condition at that time is by having national examination related to how teachers' competencies on their pedagogic and also their substantive or their subject. But when we got right now, what some of other teachers ask us is that how can teachers know the improvement of the students in subject when at this time being the teachers is only developed by their competencies on teaching strategy on compare with their subject. And then at the time the teachers has already assessed by nationally with several competencies which has already elaborated. Then when the teachers itself do not have proficient competency in their subject, then the government will develop their competencies in that competencies. But right now we do not really got any information for what assessment that has already grown up now. Can you help me how to develop teachers right now to have much more strategy on assessing the students' competencies to make the students learn? Thank you. I'm sorry, maybe my English is not so really friendly now.
It's a lot better than my Bahasa Indonesian. My message is that if you start with the students as the focus, like student assessment, student capable assessment. That then can help focus on what the teachers need to know. Because quite often, we spend so much time on understanding the teachers need to know. We've spent $1 billion in Australia taking teachers out of schools and giving them more maths and science, with almost zero effect. Because it hasn't then translated into using that depth of knowledge with their students. But if you start at the student level, if you start by looking and doing a critique of the assessments that teachers set. Now, if teachers are setting assessments that are very narrow, you've got a problem. If they're far too wide, it's a problem. If they've got incorrect information, it's a problem. It's not related to the curriculum, it's a problem. And that's where I would start to speed things up. But if you keep worrying about the teachers and the quality of the teachers, you're going to keep worrying for the rest of your life, because that's just the nature of our business. So I put the focus very much on, if the students are not making progress, the teacher's not making progress. That's a strong claim, but that is what it's about. And so that's why I would start, and that's why I start with what I'm talking about here this morning, is that you can see very quickly from understanding and talking to the students if the teachers know the difference between formative and summative. And let me tell you up front, I have no time for the concept of formative and summative assessment. There's nothing about assessment that's formative and summative. It's a judgment you make at a certain time. It's not a particular test. But teachers think it's a test, formative and summative. Madness. Not going to have any effect on the kids. But if you ask the kids, how am I going, where to next? There's your formative and summative in a sentence.
Thank you, John. Okay. Okay, I think that's the last question for our question and answer. This is a Friday, so we are limited by the time for our Friday prayers. John, thank you for the thought-provoking, I think, presentations, the idea of test and assessment that lead into interpretation of test score that resulted in a high progress or high growth. And John underlined, or actually offer how to interpret some technical term like validity, not in technical sense, and also a feedback. What is a feedback? And engagement. What is an engagement? The important part of this is a big question, which is, does the student understand, can interpret, and know what to do with their test score? Thank you. Let's give a round of applause for John Hattie. Thank you for setting aside your valuable time to be with us today. Thank you to all of you, the audience. Now we come to the end of this second keynote speakers. I return back the microphone to the master ceremony.
Thank you.
One more round of applause for John.